right.
When you have one sector shut down, that
Looks like several people are making their way in. We're up to 27 participants. Give it just a few seconds here. Chris, looks like we've got about 30, 35. It's made it in so far. You want to get us kicked off to keep us on time here?
I would. Welcome, everybody. My name is Chris Bauer. I'm the industry co-chair of the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. I want to thank you for joining us today to talk about the new ACS. Our webinar is going to introduce the new ACS, discuss its purpose, the history, as well as the structure of it. We're going to focus on 4 elements of the ACS as it relates to helicopter flying: private pilot, commercial pilot, instrument, and also the CFI. And then at the end, we're going to have some Q&A. I'm your moderator, Chris Bauer, industry co-chair for the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, and also a longtime helicopter pilot. If you want to reach out to me, you could scan that QR code, or it'll be presented at the end of the presentation as well. Joining me today is Matt Johnson. He is a senior DPE and a helicopter pilot with close to 30 years of experience. He's also a columnist for Rotor Pro magazine and has won the William T. Wynn Lifetime Achievement Award. Matt is an extremely experienced examiner, helicopter pilot, medical helicopter pilot, and has a very thorough understanding of the ACS. And Matt came to me and said, you know, it'd be great if we can walk through this. Along with Matt, myself is James Saccone and Gabrielle Rotunda from the FAA, who were instrumental in putting together the new ACS. And last but certainly not least is Mr. Tim Tucker, who is an extremely experienced DPE as well, over 40 years with close to 9,000 practical tests administered. Tim recently retired from his role as the former chief instructor at Robinson Helicopter Company. And for those of us that are Robinson pilots, we really appreciate all the work that Tim has done. Additionally, I want to thank VAI for hosting this webinar and putting it together with us. Their focus on safety and supporting the U.S. helicopter team is second to none. So we'll dive right in. We have a lot of material to go through. The purpose of the ACS. It's a labor of love with continuous alignment between different publications. Tim's raised his hand. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I'm just going to wait till you finish there, Chris. But at the end of the slides is when I think I'll probably comment. So I just want to say, though, this slide here is it's an interesting and pretty important slide. I think most people have thought that the guidance kind of dictated the standards and then the testing, and it's really not true. It's the standards that dictate what's going to be in the guidance and what's going to be in the knowledge tests. And since the standards have just come out, it's going to take a while for the other 2 documents to really get aligned with the standards. We're going to have, as you will see in a moment, new maneuvers, new definitions, and all that will have to be reflected eventually in the helicopter flying handbook and in all the knowledge tests. So it's going to take some time to align these 3, but once they get aligned, it will be fairly smooth, I think. Okay.
Thanks, Tim. Matt, did you have a comment?
No, I was just going to say, yeah, you know, to echo my good friend Tim here, this is probably one of the most beneficial slides of this presentation. And let me go back. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. So glad to have you. As Chris alluded to, we have a lot of information here to cover. And thankfully, we're going to provide all of our email addresses for you so you can reach out to us. We'll do our best to try to help you. But yeah, Tim really hit the nail on the head here. The ACS provides the foundation, if you will, for a systematic approach to ensuring consistency, currency, and accuracy between all of the documents. So if you look at the graphic at the bottom right, it's a continuous loop, if you will. It's the standards driving the guidance driving the testing, etc. Okay, so what I want to talk about here, if you're not familiar, and you don't need to really spend a lot of time on this, but jump into the Code of Federal Regulations online later and take a look at 61.14. This is the process by which these new ACS and some of the older PTSs, I believe there were 33 or 34 of those, Jim could correct me, that were incorporated by reference recently. So what we have now is you have a document that contains the ACS, and you also have something called the companion guide for pilots. The ACS is regulated. That guidance is regulated by law, if you will, whereas the companion guide is kind of a helpful guide that goes along with it. For those that purchase from the commercial vendors like the fine folks at ASA, what you'll find is they have combined those two documents into one book. So that certainly makes it helpful. And this became effective May 31st of this year.
Dive into the history of ACS. Phase 1.
Okay, if you want to just go ahead and tab right through there, Chris, we can take a quick look at this. The main core thing here to understand is that April 2024, it was in fact 33 ACS and PTS was introduced via a process known as incorporation by reference. So the actual ACS numbers for the various private instrument commercial CFI, you'll find those referenced in 61.114 by number. If you take a look at this, and just a real quick down and dirty history, is this started for our airplane brethren for many years ago to improve the knowledge test. And when that process started, and my friend Tim here was part of that early on with the ARAC, the Aviation Rule Making Advisory Council. So he can talk more to that, but they found that, well, yeah, we need to improve the knowledge test, but we can kind of do a full circle thing here and make sure that we're testing both on the practical and the knowledge exam, and realign, or a better alignment, if you will, for all of the test questions and the various tasks under the area of operation. So you can see through phase 3, 2014 through present, 2016, they started with private airplane, then instrument airplane. June 28th, a few more were added. November 2021, some of the aviation mechanic ACSs were brought on board. And then thankfully, April 2024 is the big push that included us in the helicopter community.
Now the structure.
Okay, so this is a really important slide here. If you've looked through the ACS and you found that you're kind of overwhelmed, don't fret, don't panic. It really is laid out much better. They've done a really good job on this. It's a much cleaner, much more organized document. And what you're going to find is a basic table of contents, a brief introduction, and then the areas of operation that you've been used to, but just in a much cleaner, more organized fashion. And you're also going to find 3 appendix or appendices in the back of each ACS, which is really important. You want to read line by line. The various appendices basically outline important information, very important information that must be referred to as outlined in the various tasks. So you may have notes, and we have some examples for that that we can highlight to show you that. Kudos to the FAA. They actually hyperlink this document. So I know for examiners and CFIs alike, it surely makes it a lot easier. Appendix 1, that's where you're going to find additional rating task table. So for those going for add-on ratings, that's where you're going to find that information. Appendix 2, that discusses general safety of flight information, where we talk about our, three-way exchange of controls, et cetera. And Appendix 3, super important, that's where we're going to find aircraft equipment related information and operational requirements, limitations, et cetera, such as slope limits, which previously we did not have any guidance on the numerical degree of slopes, and now we do. And I believe there was a hand raised there from Tim.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that as we'll see when we get into the tasks, that the ACS tasks are much more comprehensive than the old PTS were. And this is really going to be quite helpful for not only the applicant, but also the instructor in preparing a student for the practical test. We're going to know now exactly what's going to be covered on the practical test, which will really be helpful for, as I say, both instructor and the applicant.
All right, so here's an example here, and why it's imperative that you become familiar with the various appendices. So as an example, Appendix 3 discusses aircraft equipment operational requirements. And if you take a look here, the specifics as an example for a straight-in auto rotation shown in Appendix 2. So if you go to Area of Operation 6, performance maneuvers, and we've highlighted in red there, the straight-in auto rotation. So the note says, see Appendix 2, safety of flight, and Appendix 3, aircraft equipment and operational requirements. And you'll see underneath Task B, that's where you're going to learn about things like the minimum entry altitude must be at least 500 AGL, or a suitable higher entry altitude in strong wind conditions. So, and I know Tim wants to talk to that point a little later in another slide. All right, Chris, next slide.
Ashton, would we be able to submit one of our polling questions to the audience? Poll question number 1. For each task, the examiner must give everybody a chance to click their answer, and then we'll look at the results. All right, hopefully everybody had a chance to tackle question 1.
Okay. Overall, it looks like folks have done their homework. They didn't know there was going to be a pop quiz. All righty.
Thanks for participating. We'll have maybe a couple of more of these, well, actually several more of these during the show. Go ahead, Matt.
Second here. All right, so if you look at this slide here, this really is, if you like to, I guess we could say how the sausage is made, so to speak. This really highlights, in this case, Task A, vertical takeoff and landing. This shows us the structure of an area of operation for this specific thing, vertical takeoff and landing. So you'll see that we have a knowledge area, we have a risk management area, and then we have a skills area. If you want to tap that one more time, Chris, we'll move on. If you could just a couple more times, we could go through there. This was the absolute genius idea on their part many years ago when they developed this for airplane community, and now thankfully for us. They took the aeronautical knowledge, as you see, they took the aeronautical decision making and the special emphasis. So a lot of that extra stuff that you would see in the beginning of PTSs, CFI, instrument, commercial, private, and so forth, a lot of that information that we would have to continually read, they've taken a lot of that information, that special emphasis items, and they've incorporated it into the risk management part of this. I can't emphasize this enough. The FAA has really put risk management at the forefront on these documents, and I think you'll see that and appreciate that. Below that, you'll see flight proficiency. That's the skills area. So that's what you have come to know over the years as the PTS standards, if you will, things that have numerical values, slope, rapid decel, quick stop, tolerances, and so forth. The way that they like to talk about this is very simple. So the knowledge area, it's the know, the risk making area, risk management area is consider and then do. So it's all about know, consider, and do. If we continue here with the basic structure, and this will follow up with your first quiz question there, this is a look at how the elements are structured, if you will. So everything has a specific code, and we talked about the alignment at the beginning, and Tim talked about that early on. The idea is to associate a knowledge area, a task area, a risk management area, skills area to a given code, so that we can hone in on any deficiencies. So you'll see here PH equals the applicable ACS, I is the area of operation, C is the actual task, and then K2 would be the task element. In this example, it would be knowledge 2. Now, what's important to note here is the verbiage below that. There's no requirement for us as and I have to catch myself, as Jim reminded me earlier, there's somewhat of a language change, if you will. We are evaluators now. We are not examiners. So we'll all get used to that together. But there's no requirement for an evaluator to test every knowledge and risk management element in a task. Rather, we still have discretion. But there is a required minimum, and that is this: any elements in which the applicant was shown to be deficient on the knowledge test. So when we build our plan of actions, we have to look at those codes and incorporate that in. And that's kind of been a long-standing thing, but it's important to remind folks of that. At least one knowledge element, at least one risk management element, and absolutely all skills area must be tested. Okay, this slide may look a little messy, and I apologize. And this is where you may want to reach out to us where we can guide you. Understand this, everything that went through 61-114 and incorporation by reference and the effective date 31 May. If you have a student or you took a knowledge exam prior to 31 May, your AKTR, your knowledge test report, it's going to still have PLT codes listed at the bottom. Now, after 31 May, when you go take a knowledge exam, it's going to have actual ACS codes. So this can get a little messy. It's just going to take a little bit of work on your part as instructors and also as applicants to know where your deficiencies are so that you can go and improve on that deficiency. So what you're going to have to do is take the PLT code. In this example, PLT 141, I went into the Learning Reference Statement Guide for Airman Knowledge Testing, the most recent August of last year. And I just did a little search, and I saw that this applicant here who got a 99 on their flight instructor helicopter exam, they had one missed question, and that related to airport operations, marking signs, etc. So what I have to do then is I'm going to go to a document that the FAA provided for us, this national policy document 8900.691. And you can certainly Google that and pull that up, or Tim or I or Gabi or Jim could send that to you. But that gives us guidance, if you will, of how we're going to handle this situation until all of the knowledge tests that were taken prior to 31 May. So you're basically going to have to go in, and what the guidance is alluding to is you're going to have to go take that information. In this case, recall airport operations, marking signs, etc. Then you're going to have to go into the applicable ACS and find where that matches with that code, meaning you as the instructor are going to have to make sure you correct their deficiency, and us as examiners will have to make sure we test that. And we have, next slide here, Chris, we have a really good slide here, compliments of Gabi, that shows the difference between the two. So prior to 31 May, you'll see here on the left the PLT codes, and then something after 31 May, you'll see that the knowledge codes are broken down in that structure that we went through just a couple minutes ago. I believe Tim has his hand up.
Yeah, I just want to say that it sounds a little confusing, the mixing of the ACS codes and the PLT codes now. But once we get through this initial time frame where we just have the ACS codes, it's going to be so much easier for both the evaluator and the flight instructor, and for that matter, the applicant, to know exactly what's going to be covered. It's going to take a while, but the airplane community has, the pilot examiners I've talked to in the airplane world really like the way the new ACS codes align with what they have to cover on the practical test. So it's really going to, in the long run, be much, much easier for all concerned, I think.
Thank you, Tim. All right, so we're going to walk through some highlights now, and this is by no stretch a complete review. I can't emphasize enough that you are going to have to literally read line by line on these documents, but we are going to try to highlight a few things here. If you want to keep going there, Chris.
Do we have time for a polling question?
I thought I saw a message that maybe they weren't able to get a polling question.
There we are.
Yeah, okay. A little technical glitch, right? So just a couple highlights here, guys. Again, not an exhaustive review, if you will, but in the new ACS Task A, you're going to find that pilot qualifications focuses just on the pilot. The documents pertaining to the aircraft, they've been moved to Task B under airworthiness requirements. Couple other little things, or really one other little thing here, you'll notice the air medical factors was changed to human factors. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a big one here. Look, there are some wording changes. It's from the old PTS, it was pre-flight inspection, and now it is pre-flight assessment. And the FAA's done a good job, the folks that worked on this, in making this section include an assessment on the pilot from a human factors perspective, in addition to the assessment, if you will, or pre-flight, if you will, on the aircraft as well. This is one of those sections where the PAVE acronym needs to be fully understood by applicants. In the PTS, it was pre-flight inspection, and now, as you see here, it's pre-flight assessment. If you go down to the risk management section, you'll see that we've added the PAVE acronym there, because it's literally spelled out there in the risk management section. Okay, couple other wording changes here. We go from cockpit to flight deck management. And again, it's important to note the FAA strongly emphasizing the use of aeronautical decision-making, including single pilot resource management, crew resource management. And I want you to make note of the appendix here, see Appendix 2 note, safety of flight. And then we go down to, if we were to flip back through to Appendix 2, safety of flight, you'll see aeronautical decision-making, risk management, etc. There's a really important caveat here that I want you to see. Drag this over. If an applicant fails to use aeronautical decision-making, including SRM, CRM, et cetera, as applicable in any task, the evaluator will note that task has failed. So any task, the evaluator will also include the ADM skill element from this specific task on the notice of disapproval. Okay, so I guess in certain words, you could say it's a twofer, if you will. If there's a notice of disapproval issued for an ADM issue, or a risk management, or lack of risk management. Tim has his hand up. Chris?
Yeah, I just think it's important to note that we don't have with the ACS any more special emphasis items as we had in the old PTS. All the special emphasis items have been included in the various elements in whatever appropriate task there is. So you won't find the special emphasis items that we used to have in the PTS.
Good. So here, area of operation for hover maneuvers, if you look at the old PTS, you'll just see some reordering, if you will. But if you look at the ACS and you go down to Task E, slope operations, And again, you go down to where it says see the note, and it sends you to Appendix 3. This is really important. When you go to that section in the appendix, and I'm just going to kind of quickly go through here. Demonstration of parallel slope operations must be conducted in accordance with helicopter manufacturer limitations. So, of course, those that have us in a rigid rotor head, we do have slope limitations. But if no slope limitations are published, if the helicopter being used, parallel slopes of approximately 5 to 10 degrees may be demonstrated. Okay, here's another important thing I want to add. I've heard over the years across the country, different examiners talking or applicants talking about they did an uphill slope, etc. And you'll see that the guidance here says that landings with helicopter facing downhill or uphill will not be tested during certification. So it really, this is one of those really good areas that they worked on. It took a lot of that ambiguity. In my opinion, they took the ambiguity out of there. So, next slide, please. All right. If you take a look at Area of Operation 5 here, takeoffs, landings, and go-arounds, the examiner shall select task A, B, C, D, and E, and one other. Now with the ACS, the evaluator shall select task A, B, C, D, E, and one other. What has changed here is the go-around task, or task E, is now in fact mandatory.
Can we post one of our polling questions? In fact, I think we have one on this.
I think Ashton's doing a great job with the questions because we're getting to see who's done their homework here.
All right. I guess you know it, or you don't. What are the, take a peek at the results. Wow, 60%.
Okay.
That's really good.
All right. So, all righty. We're ready for the next slide there.
There you go.
All right. So, a change here to be aware of from the PTS, the max performance takeoff. In the PTS, it basically was plus or minus 10 knots, and now it's a plus or minus 5 knots. So they're requiring that to be tightened up, and I know we can thank our friend Tim for that. Okay, auto rotation task. All right. Now, and I've also put a note, also applies to auto rotations within turns, as well as the power failure from altitude. There's been a change here as well. The PTS was plus or minus 5 knots, and under the ACS, it's plus or minus 10 knots. Okay. So taking a kind of as deep of a dive as we can here, looking at the auto rotation task will be straight in auto rotation in a single engine helicopter. See Appendix 2 and then see Appendix 3. Under Appendix 2, this is where we find a few important things here. Auto rotations in a single engine helicopter. I've highlighted something really important there. If the reason for discontinuing the auto rotation is due to the applicant's lack of judgment or skill, the task is unsatisfactory. Okay. So make note of that. Appendix 3 is, this is where you find specifics such as the minimum entry altitude must be at least 500 AGL or suitable entry altitude in strong wind conditions. Now, I know Tim wants to take a few seconds to add to that.
Yeah, I think let's just go on a slide or two, Matt, because when we get to the 180 auto is really where I want to come.
Next slide, Chris Bauer. There you go. So same thing here, and we'll let Tim close this slide out, but the minimum entry altitude is 700 feet AGL, and you'll see at the bottom the applicant, if the applicant does not roll out of the turn by 300 feet AGL, then the evaluator must direct the applicant to perform a power recovery, initiate a go around, and it's considered unsatisfactory. All right, Tim.
Okay, there's some major differences from the way we used to test the auto rotations. First of all, now we have a minimum altitude for both the straight in and for the 180 auto. Probably not that big a deal. I think probably we had minimum altitudes in an instructional environment anyway. But what's been added that's pretty critical is that in the 180, the turn has to be completed by 300 feet above the ground. We've never had anything like that before. Now, if we use the minimum entry altitude of 700 feet for the 180, and we have to be completed the turn by 300 feet, that only gives the applicant 400 feet to make that 180-degree turn. That's going to be a pretty steep turn. So my recommendation is to get up to 1,000 or 1,200 feet to do the auto rotation with turn so that you have plenty of altitude to get the 180-degree turn out of the way. Understanding that by going up to 1,000 or 1,200 feet, you could have some traffic pattern altitude issues if you're in the same pattern with an airplane or even helicopters, which may be a different altitude. So there could be some issues by going up to the higher altitude, but being able to turn the helicopter 180 degrees and 400 feet is can be a challenge. So I recommend getting up higher, 1,000, 1,200 feet, something in that neighborhood.
Absolutely. Very good, Tim. Next slide, Chris. All right. So under emergency operations, basically you've seen some things reworded, renamed, if you will. A big one here, and again, thank you, Tim, on this. Task E, you'll see that we now use the verbiage vortex ring state. You will not find settling with power listed in this document. Couple other things. There's a note to refer to for vortex ring state. And this is basically, it's just a good crew briefing you should be doing anyway with your students and examiners with the applicant. And as discussed, one, recovery technique and selection of a safe entry altitude and where you're going to do that maneuver. Next slide. All right, so here again, the FAA's done a good job taking ambiguity out because under the PTS, you would see, power failure at altitude, you would see things like that. But now under this area of operation or emergency operations, you'll see specific tasks, like this case, task C, approach and landing with OEI. So if you bring a multi-engine aircraft to a private, and it rarely, but it does happen. I'm sure Tim has lots of good stories. But now, if that does happen, the applicant must provide a single engine helicopter for the auto rotation task. Okay, so it's not like they can bring a multi and just not do those tasks. So that applicant that brings a multi-engine helicopter to practical tests must demonstrate all of those tasks specific to a helicopter in addition to all the other required tasks. Next slide. One thing I wanted to point out here on this slide, talking about night operations, it's important, again, I can't emphasize this enough, to read line by line. In the PTS, you had 6 tasks, if you will, or items of information to prepare or make sure your students were prepared, or if you are a student, make sure you understand. Now there are 9, and that's just one example of an area of operation that is, some of them have actually doubled, so it's important to read that line by line. Next slide. All righty, so we buzzed right through the private. Now the commercial should go a little quicker. And this is, I'm sure if you haven't heard about this by now, you've been asleep at the wheels, they say. But here are the big items here under area of operation 8, emergency operations. Okay, these are new, completely new tasks, and they are required. Task L is flight solely by reference to instruments. So you'll see here that if you go to that section and you go through your knowledge area, your risk management, and then you go down to skills, which, as you hopefully remember, we're required to evaluate all of these skill elements. This is where you will find the numerical values for the flight solely by reference to instruments. So we're not going to go through those line by line. They're there, and you can certainly look that up. All right, the other new required item is task M, and that is recovery from unusual flight attitudes. And you'll find a note there to appendix 2 or 3, where you want to read that both as applicant, a instructor, and for our DPEs on here to make sure you understand what that note says there. So those are the two big required items that have been added.
Jim's got his hand up. Jim,
Okay.
did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a little of the kind of the historical emphasis around this. And this is probably, these two tasks are probably going to be the biggest controversial areas in the new ACS. And in the working group, when we discussed this, as I'm sure Jim remembers, I mean, we went through virtually everything. Some people didn't want to have any task where you had to put the hood on. Other people wanted to actually require the instrument rating or have the same 50 nautical mile day VFR only restriction that the airplane has. It was quite controversial even within the working group. But I think we kind of came, or the FAA kind of came to a pretty even ground here in that this is something that the airplane community has done at the private pilot level for over 50 years. They've, at the private pilot level, they have some required hood flying in the training. It only made sense to test it during the practical test. And as I say, the airplane community has been doing that at the private level for 50 years, plus 50 years. Now we're just going to update kind of bring the helicopter commercial into the 21st century here by actually putting the hood on during the test and testing the same exact tasks that the private airplane pilot has been tested for, they say, many, many years. So I think it's a welcome addition to the commercial ACS.
Thanks, Tim. Ashton, do we have time for another question? Task of settling with power has changed names. Wow, look at that.
Beautiful.
That's
All right.
outstanding. Thanks, Ashton.
All right, thank you, Ashton. Yeah, this is a great slide here, guys. You want to make a note of this. I know this recording will be available to you, and we can certainly provide you with a PDF of this if you need it. Kudos to both Jim and Gabrielle for putting this information together. This certainly takes, in my mind, all the ambiguity out and the questions that have come up about what type of helicopter in terms of instrumentation do we need. And this guidance came from a webinar that those two put on not long ago, last month, in fact. And basically, the equipment required for those last two tasks that we discussed, the helicopter must be instrument equipped, but not certified for instrument flight. So that applies to both the practical test and the training of the 5 hours under our 61-129 C3I, okay? Important to note here, helicopter only capable of partial panel is not acceptable for flight solely by reference to instruments and recovery from unusual attitudes, okay? So important to take note on that there. Next slide, please. And again, this is from Jim and Gabrielle. It references us to 61-145 for more clarification on that. So if we look at our ACS Appendix 3 under Aircraft Equipment Operational Requirements, the required equipment an aircraft used for a practical test must have the equipment for each area of operation required. So I like how they've made that, in my mind, in my opinion, crystal clear. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we are going to go through some instrument ACS highlights. This is going to be just a couple of slides. Next slide, please. Okay, so what you'll see here, and again, a lot of this information is compliments of both Jim and Gabrielle. The new ACS for instrument helicopter, and we're speaking specifically helicopter. So I don't want to assume, even though that a lot of these changes affected our airplane brethren, we're specifically talking about helicopters right now. But you must accomplish at least two different non-precision approaches. Okay, at least one non-precision approach must include a course reversal maneuver, such as a procedure turn, a hold in lieu of, a course reversal from an IAF, etc. And then at least one non-precision approach must be from an initial approach fix without autopilot or radar vectors. Now, you know, when Tim started this 40 years ago as an examiner, he would say, what are you talking about? And even me as 13, 14 years in as an examiner, I know things have changed. A lot of the aircraft that are brought to the instrument practical exams are a lot of times now equipped with nice autopilots. So take note of that last bullet point there. Next slide, please. All righty. More strong work here from our friends at the FAA. I know this is a big relief for a lot of folks that I provide practical tests for. Previously, we could not count a precision approach unless that got you to 300 or less than 300 height above touchdown. Now, thankfully, the guidance specifically tells us that if in fact it is an LPV, we can count that as a precision approach, both for training and testing. So I know for a lot of us, this is a big win. And I see Jim Saccone has his hand up.
Yeah, just a point of clarification on that. The LPV, as you said before, down to a decision altitude, any approach down to a decision altitude is a precision approach operation, including the LNAV, VNAV. That's part of it as well. We get a lot of questions on that, but it really is designed to help the industry with the training and the testing of our folks.
Right. Yeah. All right, next slide. All right, we are pretty much on time here. We're doing the best we can. Let's talk about some CFI highlights here. Next slide. All right, so guys, this is a big one. And Tim alluded to something earlier, talking about the knowledge codes. Until we sort through this, it may take a little more time. And I think you're going to see the same thing with the CFI practical exam itself. And I've done 2 of these so far. And it has taken a little more time on my end just because there are some new tasks and it's required some plan of action changes on my part. But I think Tim and I and all the evaluators out there will agree that once we get in the groove, if you will, of working through our plan of action, it's really not going to add a lot of additional time specifically on the CFI. So the important thing to note here is that you'll see that there's a new task, that's task F. Elements of effective teaching that include risk management and accident prevention. That's now mandatory. You'll also see now that there are 3 required tasks in the ACS versus 2 in the PTS. I believe Tim has his hand up.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, just back on the last one, I think task F there, it kind of just makes sense. I mean, if now with the ACS, we have a whole section called risk management, it just makes sense that we ought to teach instructors how to teach risk management. So the fact that this is a required task, I think makes a lot of sense.
All righty. On this slide here, you'll note that there's now 3 required tasks and not 2. You'll notice also some renaming type changes, aeromedical factors, now human factors. There is a big change here to make note of, and that is task C, runway incursion avoidance. That's now, well, it's added and it's a mandatory task. You'll also note that some of the tasks that were in area of operation 3 such as like operation of systems, performance, limitations. And that's now included in the area of operation 2. So again, I go back to read this line by line. Next slide. All right, so some new items here on the CFI. Again, a flight solely by reference to instruments and recovery from unusual attitudes, but you will note that unlike the commercial where those 2 items are a required task, these are now optional by the evaluator. You'll see the note that the evaluator must test at least 1 task from A through G, and then we must also select at least 1 task H through M tested orally. So it's not a requirement per se, but it is in the pool of tasks that we can examine them. So in the PTS, the examiner, we're talking about performance maneuvers here, and you can see how it's getting more, it's more of a comprehensive test, if you will, practical exam. In the PTS, the examiner had to select B or C, and in the new ACS, the examiner must select task A, and we've renamed that, if you will. It's now labeled rapid deceleration / quick stop, and at least 1 other task. So make note of that. Okay, so previously, and again, I think they've made this a very more of a cleaner document. If you want to pull up, hit the, there you go. Thank you, Chris. In the PTS for the CFI, it was well known. It's not tribal knowledge, but it was known that you're going to fly at the commercial level and you know, explain this from the instructional point of view, et cetera. We got that from the very beginning part of the PTS, the stuff that people tended to gloss over. But this is the highlight. What it used to say is able to perform the procedures and maneuvers, including the standards, to at least the commercial pilot skill level. The nice thing is now, just a little perk, if you will, is that those numerical values are actually included in the skills area. So you're not going to have to lug around another commercial PTS to know those limits. They're printed there for you. Next slide. Okay, common errors list. This was actually removed, and I think this is a good thing. It's being removed. It's going to force people into the books, I think. So the common errors list removed from the ACS. So if you look on the left, you have the PTS as an example, task D, normal crosswind approach. It would talk about, you know, analyzes and corrects at the bottom there, number 4, analyzes and corrects simulated common errors related to a normal crosswind approach. They still have that in the ACS, but you'll see the stuff leading up to that has been removed. So if you hit the animation for me there, Chris, what that's going to require is that you and your applicants are going to have to dig one more click. We're going to have to dig into both the helicopter flying handbook and the helicopter instructor's handbook to find those common errors to make sure that you're well aware of those. Next slide. Again, we kind of already talked about this, but if you look, here's one where a task has doubled in terms of elements. So if you look at the air taxi for PTS, we previously had 4 things to look at there and build training from and incorporate all of the items there. And now you have 8 under the knowledge area. So that area has doubled. All
Actually,
right.
time for a question.
Yeah.
On the commercial pilot practical test, tasks requiring use of a view limiting device of which?
And while everyone is making their choice. It looks like it's 1:49, 1:50, so we're pretty much on time there for our 5 to 10 minutes of questions.
All right, let's see how we did. And that's interesting with the new ACS. Matt, we
Right.
did have a question from Tom Walton. I don't know if you're able to see it or if you want me to read it or if you want.
Why don't you read that, and then whoever between the four of us, Tim and Jim and Gabrielle, whoever wants to take that, we're on time for 10 minutes of questions, so that worked out well.
Tom says, thank you all for taking the time to guide us through this. It's very insightful. Quick question. Can a CFI, not a double I, train commercial applicants in tasks L and M, given it's now more specific?
Oh, I know that was going to be defaulted to us, so it's a good question. One that if you'd like, Tom, you could send that question to me, or we just get your email address and I'll get an answer to you. It does have tentacles with airplane operations that we've had in the past with CFI versus CFI double I. What can they train? Can they cross categories and stuff like that? Unless Gabby has something, I'll take that as a question in IOU.
And yes, the answer should be yes, they can, because it says 5 hours of and not instrument training, but the training and with reference to instruments. I forgot the exact wording there, but yes, a CFI can train them for that. It does not have to be a double I for this.
Yeah,
So-
we'll just double team that just to make sure that, we have a solid answer for that. But I would agree with Gabby in this case.
Yes.
Once you have a double I, you're teaching that type of maneuvering and recovery. You also have unusual attitudes in instrument helicopter as well, which the applicant has to be proficient in. So that is something I believe would be the way to go. But we'll give the answer.
Yep, but it's correct. Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
Great question, Tom Walton. Thank you.
Jim?
Just one comment on that. I think it gives a little bit of direction to the pilot examiner in giving the flight instructor test. Obviously, since he can choose those maneuvers, he might very well choose those if the flight instructor applicant does not hold a instrument rating at all. Then he'd probably be more likely to test those two maneuvers as opposed to the applicant that does hold the instrument rating. So I think that will give the pilot examiner a little bit more direction on whether to test those two maneuvers or not during the CFI test.
Thank you, panelists, for helping with that one. We have another question from Daniel Boone. For an add-on without written test required, how is plan of action different than initial?
I can take that. Dan, hello to you. So with no knowledge exam required, there's hence no missed questions that we have to incorporate into the plan of action. But if you'll remember from the basic structure, we have to examine at least one knowledge area, one risk management, and all skill areas. Now, appendix 1 or 2 is where you'll find the add-on matrix that you have grown accustomed to. Now, that is the minimum that we must test. I will tell you that we are still open, and I think my friend Tim will agree with me that we usually do a little bit more than just the minimum. I will also bring this up because great question, Dan. I recently did a CFI renewal based on a flight test under the new ACS, and I'm here to tell you it took a little longer. I really had to dig in there and go line by line and adapt my plan of action because there are some, a couple additional things. So it took just a little longer to do that. So hopefully I answered your question there.
Thanks, Matt. We've got another question from Sam Daughtry. The new instrument skills are for commercial and CFI ACS. It's not included in the private pilot, correct?
You are correct, sir. And that's what Tim alluded to earlier. Tim, how long has that been in for airplane private? 30, 40, 50 years, I think you said.
Well, when I was teaching airplanes in the early 70s, it was a requirement. So
Yeah, yeah. So hello to my good friend Sam. But to answer your question, no, Sam, that's just commercial and it's optional under the CFI.
We have a question from Benjamin, which maybe goes along the same lines of legacy instrument training. Is the DME ARC still required for 6157 Delta?
I can take that. So in the appendix, it states that the evaluator may not select DME arcs unless it's charted and available, including the use of RNAP substitution techniques if appropriate. So meaning if the evaluator cannot say, well, let's fly the 20 DME arc around the Vero Beach VOR. So that's no longer possible. It has to be charted. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, Gabby. Well, I'll roll over to the next slide. For our listeners today, if you're not familiar with the USHST website, you can find a treasure trove of information there. We have a lot of HSEs or helicopter safety enhancements that are very well written white papers that you can share with your students that talk about different aspects of helicopter flying that are researched based on accidents that have occurred and best practices. And they come from the FAA and the OEMs and instructors such as yourself. You can also join the USHST and you can get a free subscription to the Hughes app. There's a QR code there. It'll take you to the place in the Apple Store where you could get your hands on what's all in the app, a bunch of safety information, weather, NOTAMs, charts, on-ship display, and the FAA's weather camera access. This presentation will be also posted on the USHST website, as well as the VAI YouTube channel afterwards, in case someone you work with or student or somebody would like to observe it that wasn't able to make it today. We have another question from Elon Head. How are you doing, Elon? I know you're muted, but good to see you. Must applicants demonstrate a specific recovery technique for VRS?
I'll let Tim run with that one.
okay, well, we now have actually 3 acceptable recovery techniques for the vortex ring state. What I call the traditional recovery technique, the Richard recovery technique, and the new Airbus recovery technique. And I think the ACS doesn't require any specific one be used. It just requires that a technique be used and a recovery be made. So obviously, I think the pilot examiner should discuss with the applicant in the pre-flight briefing which technique the applicant intends to use, and then that would be the case there.
Super. Yeah, great question, Alon. Glad you're on. To add to Tim's point, there is, and I think I covered it in one of the slides, there is an appendix note there that you have just what Tim said, a discussion with the applicant about what to expect, what technique, and even in the helicopter flying handbook, I'm embarrassed to say, I can't think, I think it was 2019 was the last update. They are in the process of being updated, but even in that guidance, a lateral recovery technique is discussed therefore acceptable on a practical exam.
Alon, thank you very much for participating today and your question. We have one more question. As a follow-up to the DME ARC, if a test is conducted in a simulator, is the evaluator expected to force the aircraft to an area that provides an ARC to test the maneuver? Or is there no ARC in the area in question? Is it sufficient to say that it was just not available?
I could, I'm not sure
That's
I
tough.
understand the question correctly, but Gabrielle, do you have a take on that? How did you hear that question?
If there is an arc charted, then that should be a required task, as far as I understand.
I think if I could jump in, I think if I understand the question, if they're in a simulator, can they move the operations to an airport that may have a DME ARC approach associated with the airport so the applicant can demonstrate it? On the 142 and maybe under 141, if they have testing ability in a C or D simulator, that might be possible. Gabrielle and I don't work with the 142 environment as much as we do with the 141 and Part 61. We can get you an answer on that, but my understanding is in the past we've seen operators do that. They'll take you to Okinawa and do an approach there, and it's all the same. But we'll get you an answer on that. If I could just have that individual's contact information, we'll definitely address that for you.
It was an anonymous, and our only anonymous attendee that submitted it. As a 142 instructor, it's an unusual question in that I've been in a situation where I needed, let's say, a DME ARC, and we're training in the aircraft, and the closest DME ARC was more than 100 miles away. And I'd certainly say that means it's not in my area, it's not practical to do that because I can't readily get to one. But in a simulator where you can reposition to another location, I'm not sure that I fully understand it, unless the simulator isn't capable of repositioning to a facility that has a charted DME ARC. So curious question.
Yeah.
Right.
Hey, Matt, if I could just jump in for a sec.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, folks, it's been a pleasure working with U.S. Helicopter Safety Team. Gabby and I became aware that they were putting on this presentation for you to in back of ours, which I think they did an outstanding job with. But the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team also has had personal hands-on the changes in the ACS over the last 6-7 years with the FAA. And we've had 3 hard charges from there: Tim Tucker, Nick Mayhew, and Philip Wenards, all representing U.S. Helicopter Safety Team, coming in, giving us fantastic ideas on how these documents should be shaped. So hats off to the U.S. Helicopter Safety Team for doing this presentation and having such a great following. So we really appreciate you.
Right.
Jim, thank you for your kind remarks and your support of the USHST, and of course our whole pilot community with these new standards. I think if we have a moment, maybe we'll just go around the room here for closing remarks. Maybe start with you, Matt.
Well, yeah, I think I've mentioned this numerous times, but hey, what's one more? It's imperative that you read line by line, go old school, get out a highlighter. Again, the FAA did a good job in the layout of how this document prints. It's full size and it's hyperlinked. So on your iPad, it's super easy to go through. So read line by line and get to know these documents inside and out.
I would just say that I go back to the airplane world, and when the ACS first came out, there was quite a bit of controversy and some bad feelings actually in transitioning to the new ACS from the PTS. But now I think pretty much the entire airplane community has come around and they all think the ACS has been a big improvement. And so I think luckily we won't experience that in the helicopter world. We're going to go right to the good parts of the ACS and no controversy or anything like that. I think everybody's going to find it much easier. Instructors, applicants, and pilot examiners are going to find this a much easier tool to use.
That's what that white effect got better change.
Agreed.
All right, then. I want to thank all of you who took the time to participate in the webinar today. It speaks volumes of your professionalism to be able to do that in the middle of the day. We're looking to maybe take a deeper dive and go into each section and devote more time to it. Let us know if that's of interest to you. I want to also thank again VAI for hosting this important webinar and supporting the USHST. Thank you for our FAA participants. Matt, Tim, really appreciate your time and the work that you put into this all along and today as well. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for participating. We'll see you again.
Thank you.